My name is Marcus Draven, and I spent 7 years moving between the prison systems of Azeroth. Not by choice, mind you, but because war has a way of making prisoners of us all, and I learned that how a civilization treats its captives reveals more about its true nature than any banner or proclamation ever could. I need you to understand something before I tell you what I witnessed in those dark places. There is no universal mercy in war, only degrees of cruelty masked as necessity, honor, or justice. What I saw changed everything I believed about the Alliance, about honor, about what we become when we think no one is watching. The first time I was captured, I still believed in the stories they tell children about Alliance honor. I was 23 years old, a junior intelligence officer attached to the 7th Legion during what historians now call the Third War. My capture came during a routine reconnaissance mission near Durnhold Keep, when an orc patrol found our position and overwhelmed our small unit with brutal efficiency. 3 of my companions died in the initial assault. 2 others were so badly wounded they couldn't be moved. I watched the orcs examine them for a moment, their faces unreadable behind battle-scarred features, before delivering quick, clean deaths with ceremonial axes. At the time, I thought it was cruelty. Years later, I would understand it as mercy. They bound my hands with rough hemp rope and forced me to march for 6 hours through terrain that seemed designed to break the spirit of anyone foolish enough to traverse it. My captors spoke little during the journey, communicating mostly through grunts and gesture, but I caught fragments of their conversation when they thought I wasn't listening. They were debating what to do with me, whether I had value as a source of intelligence, or if I should be executed as quickly as my fallen comrades. The decision, apparently, would be made by someone with more authority than a patrol leader. We arrived at a temporary horde encampment as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red that reminded me uncomfortably of the blood my unit had spilled just hours before. The camp was larger than I had expected, housing perhaps 200 warriors and support personnel, all arranged with military precision that spoke to experienced leadership. Cooking fires sent thin columns of smoke into the evening air, carrying the smell of roasted meat and unfamiliar spices that made my empty stomach clench with hunger. I was placed in a pen with 7 other Alliance prisoners, all captured during recent engagements in the region. The pen itself was nothing more than a square of wooden stakes driven into the ground, connected by rope that wouldn't have stopped a determined escape attempt. But the 2 orc guards posted nearby carried weapons that would have made any such attempt very brief and very final. My fellow prisoners were a mixed group: 2 Stormwind foot soldiers, a dwarf mountaineer, a night elf scout whose purple skin was mottled with bruises, a gnome engineer who kept muttering calculations under his breath, and a human mage whose hands were bound with special restraints designed to prevent spellcasting. Each of them had been captured under different circumstances, and each had a different story about their treatment since falling into Horde hands. The dwarf, whose name was Thorek Ironbeard, had been a prisoner for nearly 2 weeks. He told me that the orcs fed their captives once daily, provided basic medical attention for serious injuries, and had not engaged in what he called unnecessary brutality. The night elf, who gave her name as Whisperwind, disagreed. She spoke of interrogations that lasted for hours, of questions asked in broken common that made it clear her captors knew more about Alliance troop movements than they should have. The gnome engineer, Sparkwhistle, had a different perspective entirely. He claimed that his captors had shown genuine interest in his technical knowledge, asking detailed questions about Alliance siege equipment and defensive fortifications. Not for intelligence purposes, he insisted, but out of what seemed like professional curiosity. Engineering, apparently, was a language that transcended factional boundaries. But it was the mage, a woman named Lirelei Moonwhisper, who provided the most disturbing information about our situation. She had been captured 3 days earlier during a failed assault on a Horde supply convoy, and her treatment had been markedly different from the others. The Orcs had identified her magical abilities immediately and had taken special precautions to prevent her from casting spells. But they had also separated her from other prisoners for individual questioning sessions that she described with visible shuddering. They wanted to know about Alliance magical defenses, about the location of mage towers and arcane repositories, about the names and capabilities of specific spellcasters serving in Alliance forces. The questions themselves were not unusual for military interrogation, but the methods used to extract answers had crossed lines that even experienced soldiers were reluctant to discuss in detail. I spent 3 days in that pen, observing the casual efficiency with which the Horde managed their captives, before word came that we were to be transported to a more permanent facility. The journey took 2 days, during which I learned more about Horde prisoner policies than any Alliance intelligence manual had ever taught me. We were fed regularly, allowed to rest during the hottest parts of the day, and provided with basic medical attention when the Night Elf Scout developed signs of infection in wounds sustained during her capture. But we were also kept under constant guard, bound at all times except when eating or attending to bodily functions, and reminded frequently that our continued survival depended entirely on our cooperation with our captors' requirements. The guards spoke little common, but their body language made their intentions clear enough. We were valuable as long as we remained useful. The moment that calculation changed, our value would be measured in the time it took to swing an axe. The permanent facility turned out to be a converted fortress deep in contested territory, its original Alliance architecture modified with Horde engineering to create something that served neither faction's aesthetic sensibilities. The walls were massive stone blocks quarried from local mountains, reinforced with wooden palisades and iron spikes that would have made assault costly for Khuf, any attacking force. Guard towers rose at regular intervals, manned by warriors whose alertness never seemed to waver regardless of the time of day or night. Inside the walls, the facility was divided into several distinct areas. Administrative buildings housed the personnel responsible for managing the prison population and coordinating with higher command structures. Barracks provided accommodation for guards and support staff. A medical facility, staffed by a troll shaman whose bedside manner was surprisingly gentle, treated injuries and illnesses among both prisoners and guards. And in the center of it all stood the cell blocks, 3 separate buildings designed to house different categories of captives. I was assigned to Block 2, which housed what the Horde classified as intelligence value prisoners. These were Alliance personnel whose knowledge, skills, or connections made them worth keeping alive for potential interrogation or prisoner exchange. The cells were small but clean, with stone walls that wept moisture during rain and wooden floors that showed signs of regular maintenance. Each cell contained a simple cot, a waste bucket, and a small barred window that provided minimal light and fresh air. The daily routine was monotonous, but bearable. We were awakened at dawn by guards who brought a breakfast of thin gruel, stale bread, and water that tasted of the iron pipes that delivered it. Morning hours were spent in individual cells, with prisoners allowed to exercise in small groups under supervision. Lunch was similar to breakfast, with the occasional addition of vegetables or small portions of meat that suggested our captors understood basic nutritional requirements. Afternoons brought the interrogation sessions that gave Block 2 its purpose. These were conducted by a rotating cast of Horde intelligence officers, each with their own methods and areas of interest. Some focused on military intelligence, troop strengths, defensive positions, supply lines, leadership personalities. Others wanted information about Alliance politics, economic resources, technological capabilities, diplomatic relationships with neutral factions. The interrogators themselves were a diverse group that reflected the racial composition of the Horde. Orc officers approached questioning with straightforward directness, asking clear questions and expecting honest answers. Troll interrogators used psychological techniques that seemed designed to confuse and disorient their subjects, mixing truth with speculation until prisoners found it difficult to distinguish between what they actually knew and what they had been led to believe. Tauren questioners demonstrated patience that bordered on the supernatural, willing to spend hours building rapport with their subjects before introducing any sensitive topics. But it was the Forsaken interrogators who left the most lasting impression on everyone who encountered them. They brought to their work a clinical detachment that made even the most hardened soldiers uncomfortable. Pain, fear, hope, despair. These were simply tools to be applied as circumstances required. They studied their subjects with the same methodical attention a scholar might give to an ancient text, looking for patterns and connections that could be exploited to extract maximum information with minimum effort. I underwent interrogation sessions with representatives of each race, and each experience taught me something different about both my captors and myself. The Orc officers wanted to know about Alliance logistics and supply systems, areas where my intelligence training had provided relevant knowledge. They asked direct questions and accepted honest answers when I provided them, but they also made it clear that deception would be met with immediate and unpleasant consequences. The Troll interrogator, a scarred veteran whose accent made common sound like a foreign language even when spoken correctly, focused on Alliance intelligence gathering methods. He wanted to understand how we collected information about Horde activities, what sources we considered reliable, how we analyzed and distributed intelligence to field commanders. His questions revealed a sophisticated understanding of intelligence work that surprised me, and suggested that the Horde's own information-gathering capabilities were more advanced than Alliance estimates indicated. The Tauren officer, a massive warrior whose gentle demeanor contrasted sharply with his intimidating physical presence, asked about Alliance attitudes toward the natural world and our relationships with druidic organizations. He seemed genuinely curious about human and dwarf perspectives on environmental stewardship, and our conversation often wandered into philosophical territory that had little to do with military intelligence. But it was my session with the Forsaken interrogator that taught me the most about the true nature of prisoner treatment in this facility. She introduced herself as Apothecary Tristessa, though I suspected that neither her name nor her rank was entirely accurate. Her appearance was unsettling even by Forsaken standards. Pale skin stretched tight over angular bones, eyes that glowed with unnatural light, movements that suggested mechanical precision rather than organic fluidity. Tristessa's questions focused on Alliance attitudes toward the undead, our policies for dealing with Scourge remnants and Forsaken refugees, our understanding of necromantic magic and its applications. She asked about specific individuals within Alliance leadership, their personal histories and psychological profiles, their likely reactions to various forms of psychological pressure. But what made the interrogation truly disturbing was not the questions themselves, but the casual way she discussed the methods available for extracting answers. She spoke of pain as a craftsman might discuss tools, analyzing the effectiveness of different approaches for different personality types. Physical pain was crude but reliable for breaking down immediate resistance. Psychological pressure took longer but produced more lasting compliance. Chemical agents could be precisely calibrated to produce specific emotional states that made subjects more cooperative. She never actually employed any of these methods during our session, but the implicit threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. This was not cruelty for its own sake, but rather a professional assessment of available options. If I proved uncooperative, if the intelligence I possessed was deemed sufficiently valuable, If orders came down from higher authority, she would apply whatever techniques were necessary to extract the required information. And she would do so with the same clinical detachment she brought to every aspect of her work. My time in Block 2 lasted for 6 weeks, during which I observed the treatment of dozens of other Alliance prisoners and learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated changes in our captors' intentions. New arrivals were processed with routine efficiency, their possessions catalogued, their injuries treated, their intelligence value assessed through initial questioning. Those deemed most valuable received individual cells and regular interrogation sessions. Others were assigned to group housing where they served as sources of general information about Alliance capabilities and intentions. But I also witnessed the consequences for prisoners who were judged to have outlived their usefulness. They simply disappeared from the facility during the night, transferred to other locations for purposes that were never explained to the remaining population. Some prisoners claimed these transfers were actually executions, quick and efficient disposal of individuals who no longer served any intelligence purpose. Others insisted that the transfers were legitimate, that prisoners were being moved to exchange points or labor details or other facilities better suited to their circumstances. I never learned which interpretation was correct, but the uncertainty itself served as an effective control mechanism. Every prisoner in Block 2 understood that their continued survival depended on maintaining their value to their captors, and this understanding shaped every interaction with guards and interrogators. The daily routine of prison life created its own strange normalcy, a rhythm of survival that made it possible to endure circumstances that should have been unbearable. Prisoners developed informal hierarchies based on military rank, length of captivity, and perceived value to our captors. We shared information about guard schedules and interrogation techniques, traded rations and personal items, created informal systems of mutual support that helped everyone cope with the psychological pressure of indefinite captivity. But beneath this veneer of adaptation, tensions simmered constantly. National and racial prejudices that might have been suppressed during active military service surfaced under the stress of imprisonment. Human prisoners sometimes expressed resentment toward Night Elf or dwarf cellmates whose treatment seemed preferential. Night Elves struggled with the artificial environment and the absence of natural surroundings that were essential to their psychological well-being. Dwarves chafed at the restrictions on physical activity and the poor quality of the ale substitute provided during evening rations. These tensions were carefully monitored and occasionally exploited by our captors, who understood that divided prisoners were easier to manage than unified ones. Information extracted during individual interrogations was sometimes shared with other prisoners in ways that created suspicion and mistrust within our informal community. Privileges were distributed unequally, creating competition for favorable treatment that undermined collective resistance efforts. I learned to navigate these dynamics through careful observation and calculated cooperation with both my fellow prisoners and our Horde captors. I provided truthful but limited information during interrogation sessions, sharing knowledge that would not compromise ongoing Alliance operations while demonstrating enough cooperation to maintain my value as an intelligence source. I participated in the informal prisoner community without revealing details that could be used to exploit others. I maintained hope for eventual escape or rescue while preparing mentally for the possibility that neither would come. But as weeks stretched into months, I began to understand that the Horde's prisoner management system was designed not just to extract intelligence, but to gradually break down the psychological resistance of captives until they became willing collaborators rather than reluctant sources. The process was subtle and almost gentle in its application, but inexorably effective in achieving its intended results. Some prisoners began to express admiration for Horde military efficiency and organizational capabilities. Others started to criticize Alliance leadership decisions that had led to their capture and abandonment. A few began to hint that life in Horde territory might not be as barbaric as Alliance propaganda had suggested, that there might be opportunities for individuals willing to reconsider their loyalties. These shifts in attitude were carefully noted by our captors and used to identify prisoners who might be suitable for more advanced forms of psychological manipulation. I watched fellow Alliance soldiers gradually transform from patriotic warriors into confused, demoralized individuals who questioned everything they had once believed about honor, duty, and the righteousness of their cause. And I began to understand that this transformation was exactly what our captors intended, that the real purpose of facilities like Block 2 was not simply to house enemy prisoners, but to create converts who would eventually return to Alliance territory as unwitting agents of Horde influence. The revelation came during my final interrogation session, when Apothecary Tristessa casually mentioned that my release was being arranged through a prisoner exchange that would return me to Alliance custody within the week. She spoke as if this was routine administrative business, but something in her tone suggested that my impending freedom was part of a larger strategy rather than simple military courtesy. She wanted me to return to Alliance service carrying specific impressions about Horde capabilities and intentions, carefully crafted perceptions that would influence my reports to intelligence superiors and shape Alliance strategic planning in ways that served Horde interests. My apparent cooperation during captivity had identified me as someone who might be susceptible to subtle manipulation, someone whose loyalty could be gradually eroded through exposure to carefully selected information and experiences. The prisoner exchange took place at dawn on a foggy morning that reduced visibility to a few dozen meters in any direction. I was transported to the meeting point in a wagon alongside 4 other Alliance prisoners, all of whom had been selected for release according to criteria that were never explained to us. Horde representatives met with their Alliance counterparts in a formal ceremony that emphasized the honor and dignity of both factions while accomplishing the practical business of trading captives. But as I was handed over to Alliance custody and began the journey back to friendly territory, I carried with me not just relief at my freedom, but a deep unease about what I had learned during my captivity. The Horde had demonstrated capabilities and sophistication that Alliance intelligence estimates had consistently undervalued. Their treatment of prisoners revealed strategic thinking that extended far beyond immediate military objectives, and their understanding of human psychology suggested that future conflicts would be fought on battlefields that extended into the minds and souls of combatants. I returned to Alliance service a changed man, though it took months before I fully understood the nature of that change. My reports on Horde prisoner treatment were filed and analyzed and incorporated into intelligence assessments that would shape Alliance policies for years to come. But I never revealed the most important lesson I had learned during my captivity, that the enemy's greatest weapon was not their military might or their battlefield courage, but their patience and their willingness to invest in victories that might not be apparent until years after they were achieved. The Alliance had rules about prisoner treatment, detailed codes that specified minimum standards of care and prohibited various forms of abuse. These rules were printed in military manuals and taught in officer training schools and cited in diplomatic negotiations as evidence of Alliance moral superiority. But the gap between written policies and actual practice was vast enough to hide entire armies of uncomfortable truths. My second capture came 3 years later, during what Alliance commanders called a routine border patrol, but what I now recognize as a deliberate intelligence-gathering operation designed to test Horde response capabilities in contested territories. I had been promoted to senior intelligence analyst by then. My experience with Horde prisoner systems considered valuable enough to warrant field assignment despite my documented psychological concerns about the effectiveness of their indoctrination techniques. The circumstances of my capture were different this time, more personal somehow, though I did not understand why until much later. The Horde patrol that ambushed our reconnaissance team was led by the same Orc officer who had supervised my interrogation during my previous captivity, a veteran warrior named Gorthok Bloodfang, whose scarred face had appeared in my dreams more often than I cared to admit. He recognized me immediately, his expression shifting from professional satisfaction to something that might have been genuine pleasure at our reunion. "You returned to us, Alliance spy," he said in common that had improved considerably since our last meeting. "This time we learn what you really know about our methods. The camp where they took me was different from the permanent facility I had experienced before, smaller and more mobile, designed to support rapid movement through territory that might change hands without warning. But the fundamental approach to prisoner management remained consistent with what I had observed previously, a careful balance between practical necessity and cultural tradition that revealed more about Horde society than any diplomatic briefing ever could. Orcish concepts of honorable combat extended to prisoner treatment in ways that both surprised and disturbed me. Enemies who had fought bravely were accorded a level of respect that seemed almost ceremonial, their weapons and personal effects treated with reverence rather than simple practicality. Warriors who had distinguished themselves in battle were often given opportunities to earn better treatment through demonstrations of skill or courage, even while remaining captives. But this honor system was paired with casual brutality toward those deemed unworthy of respect. Alliance soldiers who had surrendered without fighting, who had shown cowardice in battle, or who had violated what Orcs considered basic warrior ethics, were treated with open contempt that could escalate to lethal violence without warning. The distinction was not based on military rank or strategic importance, but on purely cultural assessments of personal worth that Alliance training had never prepared me to understand. I watched an Alliance sergeant who had attempted to surrender while his men were still fighting receive treatment that bordered on ritualistic humiliation. His requests for water were ignored. His attempts to communicate with guards were met with deliberate silence, and his allocation of food was reduced to a level that maintained survival but little else. When he finally died 3 weeks later, officially from wounds sustained during capture, but actually from the systematic degradation of his will to live, his Orc guards performed burial rites that honored the warrior they believed he might have been, rather than the man he actually was. The contrast with their treatment of a dwarf mountaineer captured during the same engagement was striking. The dwarf had continued fighting long after his position was hopeless, using improvised weapons and terrain advantages to kill 2 Orc warriors before finally being overwhelmed. Despite being technically an enemy combatant, he was treated with genuine respect by his captors, who seemed to regard his stubborn resistance as admirable rather than problematic. They called him Stoneheart and included him in evening conversations around their campfires, translating questions and comments between Common and Orcish so that he could participate in discussions about tactics and strategy. When he developed infection in wounds sustained during his capture, the camp shaman devoted considerable time and resources to his treatment, explaining to me later that allowing such a warrior to die from neglect would bring shame to the entire clan. This honor-based approach to prisoner treatment was complicated by the racial diversity of the Horde itself, with each member species bringing its own cultural perspectives to bear on questions of captivity and control. Tauren warriors demonstrated reverence for life that extended even to enemy captives, providing medical attention and spiritual counsel that seemed motivated by genuine compassion rather than strategic calculation. I spent 2 weeks under the direct supervision of a Tauren elder named Windwalker Moonhoof, who treated my ongoing psychological difficulties with patience that bordered on the supernatural. He recognized signs of what Alliance medics would have diagnosed as combat trauma, the result of repeated exposure to interrogation techniques designed to break down psychological resistance. But rather than exploiting these vulnerabilities for intelligence purposes, he focused on helping me develop coping mechanisms that would allow me to function despite the emotional damage I had sustained. His approach combined practical counseling with spiritual practices that drew on Tauran connections to natural forces and ancestral wisdom. We spent hours each morning in meditation exercises that were supposed to help me reconnect with fundamental sources of strength and stability. Evening sessions involved conversation about the nature of conflict and the possibility of finding meaning in suffering, philosophical discussions that had little direct relevance to military intelligence, but somehow left me feeling more centered and capable of rational thought. When I asked him why he was investing so much effort in the psychological well-being of an enemy prisoner, his answer revealed depths of cultural sophistication that Alliance intelligence assessments had consistently overlooked. The Earth Mother teaches us that all life is connected, he explained in common, that carried the measured cadence of formal ceremony. When we damage the spirit of our enemies, we damage our own spirits as well. When we heal those who oppose us, we heal the wounds that war creates in all living things. This philosophy shaped Tauran prisoner policies in ways that created practical advantages for their military operations, while maintaining spiritual principles that were central to their cultural identity. Prisoners under Tauran supervision were more likely to provide accurate intelligence because they trusted their captors to treat information with appropriate respect. They were less likely to attempt escape or sabotage because their physical and psychological needs were being met. And they were more susceptible to eventual conversion because they experienced Horde treatment as genuinely superior to what Alliance propaganda had led them to expect. But the Tauran approach represented only one facet of Horde prisoner management, and other member races brought very different perspectives to bear on similar problems. Troll interrogators employed ritualistic techniques that combined practical psychology with spiritual practices rooted in ancestral traditions that stretched back thousands of years before the formation of the Horde itself. I underwent questioning by a troll shadow priest named Zul Than, who approached intelligence extraction as a form of religious ceremony rather than simple military procedure. His questions were accompanied by chanting in ancient dialects that seemed designed to create altered states of consciousness in his subjects. Herbal preparations were burned during our sessions, filling the air with smoke that had mild psychoactive properties and made it difficult to maintain normal cognitive defenses against psychological manipulation. The content of his questions revealed sophisticated understanding of Alliance psychological profiles and institutional weaknesses. He wanted to know about religious and philosophical divisions within Alliance leadership, about personal conflicts between major political figures, about sources of cultural tension that might be exploited to create internal discord. But his methods for extracting this information involved spiritual techniques that felt more like religious conversion than military interrogation. He spoke of visions received during trance states, of guidance from ancestral spirits who provided insight into Alliance strategic planning, of connections to natural forces that allowed him to perceive truths that conventional intelligence gathering could never reveal. Whether these claims had any basis in supernatural reality or were simply sophisticated psychological manipulation designed to confuse and disorient his subjects, I was never able to determine with certainty. What I could determine was that his techniques were remarkably effective at extracting information from prisoners who might have resisted more conventional interrogation methods. The combination of chemical alteration, spiritual theater, and cultural unfamiliarity created an environment where normal psychological defenses became unreliable. Prisoners found themselves sharing information they had intended to protect, not because they had been broken by torture or coercion, but because the boundaries between voluntary and involuntary disclosure had become blurred beyond recognition. The most disturbing aspect of troll prisoner treatment was not the extraction of military intelligence, but the gradual spiritual conversion that accompanied prolonged exposure to their ritualistic methods. Prisoners began to experience dreams and visions that seemed to come from external sources rather than their own unconscious minds. They reported sensing presences that offered guidance and comfort in exchange for cooperation with their captors. They developed belief systems that incorporated elements of troll spirituality while maintaining surface loyalty to Alliance principles. When these converted prisoners were eventually released through exchange programs or escape attempts, they carried with them spiritual influences that shaped their subsequent behavior in ways that served Horde strategic interests while remaining invisible to Alliance security screening. They became unwitting agents of influence who promoted policies and perspectives that undermined Alliance cohesion without ever realizing that their loyalty had been compromised. The Blood Elf approach to prisoner management reflected their mastery of arcane magic and their sophisticated understanding of how magical manipulation could be applied to intelligence gathering and psychological control. Unlike the spiritual techniques employed by troll interrogators, Blood Elf methods were based on precise application of magical energies that could alter memory, emotion, and perception with surgical accuracy. I was questioned by a Blood Elf magistrix named Lyralyn Dawnseeker, whose magical abilities allowed her to access information stored in my mind without requiring conscious cooperation on my part. She could identify specific memories related to Alliance strategic planning and extract detailed knowledge while leaving other mental functions intact. The experience was deeply violating in ways that physical torture could never match. A form of psychological rape that left no visible wounds but damaged fundamental aspects of personal identity. Her techniques could implant false memories that seemed completely authentic to the subject, creating conviction about events that had never actually occurred. She could modify emotional associations connected to specific people or ideas, transforming loyal Alliance soldiers into individuals who experienced genuine revulsion when contemplating service to their former commanders. She could enhance or suppress particular personality traits, making prisoners more compliant or more aggressive as circumstances required. But the most sophisticated application of Blood Elf prisoner manipulation involved the creation of what they called sleeper assets. Individuals who remained consciously loyal to Alliance principles while carrying buried programming that could be activated years later through specific triggers. These converted prisoners returned to Alliance service with no awareness that their loyalty had been compromised, functioning normally until predetermined conditions activated hidden instructions that compelled them to perform actions that served Blood Elf interests. The creation of sleeper assets required months of careful magical conditioning, with each stage of the process designed to remain undetectable by conventional security screening methods. The Magistrix explained the general principles to me during one of our sessions, describing the technique as an elegant solution to the problem of long-term intelligence penetration in organizations with sophisticated counterintelligence capabilities. "We plant seeds that grow slowly," she said with obvious pride in her professional expertise. "When the harvest comes, our enemies will never understand why their most trusted servants suddenly turn against them. They will suspect treachery and betrayal, but they will never think to look for magical conditioning that was applied years before the crisis began." Forsaken approaches to prisoner treatment reflected their unique perspective as formerly human undead, who retained memories of their previous existence while serving masters whose goals often conflicted with human welfare. This created a disturbing combination of technical expertise and emotional detachment that made them perhaps the most effective interrogators in the entire Horde military structure. Forsaken prisoners were routinely subjected to chemical experimentation that tested various compounds for their effectiveness in extracting information, modifying behavior, or simply causing suffering for research purposes. The distinction between intelligence gathering and scientific research was often unclear, with individual prisoners serving simultaneously as sources of military information and test subjects for new plague formulations or mind control compounds. I observed the treatment of several Alliance prisoners who were selected for what Forsaken scientists called enhanced interrogation protocols, procedures that combined traditional questioning with exposure to chemical agents that produced specific psychological and physiological effects. Some compounds enhanced memory recall, making it easier for subjects to provide detailed information about events they had witnessed or plans they had heard discussed. Others reduced psychological resistance to authority, creating temporary states of compliance that could be exploited for intelligence purposes. The most disturbing experiments involved compounds designed to test the viability of converting living prisoners into undead servants who would retain their original knowledge and personality while serving Forsaken masters. These procedures had low success rates and often resulted in the death or permanent madness of test subjects, but the potential strategic value of converted Alliance personnel made them worth pursuing despite ethical considerations that would have prevented similar research in other military organizations. Forsaken interrogators approached their work with clinical detachment that was somehow more chilling than open sadism would have been. They studied prisoner responses to various stimuli with the same objective curiosity that Alliance scholars might bring to archaeological research, documenting reactions and refining techniques without apparent concern for the suffering they caused. When I asked one Forsaken apothecary about the moral implications of using living prisoners for chemical experimentation, her response revealed the fundamental difference between undead and living perspectives on questions of ethics and suffering. "Pain is temporary," she explained in a voice that carried no emotion whatsoever. "Death is final. But knowledge gained through our research will serve the Horde for generations to come. The sacrifice of a few enemy prisoners to advance our understanding of behavioral modification is a reasonable price for ensuring Forsaken survival in a world that seeks our destruction." Goblin prisoner management reflected their mercantile culture and pragmatic approach to resource allocation, with captives evaluated primarily in terms of their economic potential rather than their intelligence value or strategic importance. Prisoners were classified according to their skills, connections, and ransom value, then allocated to work details or negotiation processes that maximized their contribution to Goblin financial objectives. Skilled craftsmen and engineers were put to work on projects that served Goblin industrial interests, their expertise exploited to improve manufacturing processes or develop new technologies that could be sold to other Horde factions. Prisoners with wealthy families or important political connections were held for ransom negotiations that could extend for months while their market value was assessed and optimal pricing strategies were developed. Those prisoners deemed to have minimal economic potential were assigned to labor details that supported Goblin mining and manufacturing operations, working under conditions that prioritized productivity over worker welfare, but stopped short of the lethal exploitation that might reduce the overall workforce through excessive mortality. Even expendable prisoners represented investments that needed to generate positive returns over their useful lifespans. The Goblin approach to prisoner treatment was perhaps the most honest in its acknowledgement that captives were resources to be exploited rather than enemies to be defeated or converted. There was no pretense of honor, no spiritual justification for suffering, no ideological framework that transformed cruelty into virtue. Prisoners were valuable as long as they remained productive, and their treatment was calibrated to maintain optimal performance levels while minimizing costs associated with their upkeep. But this mercantile honesty created its own forms of psychological pressure, that were no less effective than the more sophisticated techniques employed by other Horde factions. Prisoners understood exactly how their value was calculated and what they needed to do to maintain favorable treatment. This clarity eliminated much of the uncertainty and confusion that made other forms of captivity so psychologically damaging, but it also reduced human beings to economic units whose worth could be precisely quantified and adjusted according to market conditions. The transition from Thrall's leadership to Garrosh's control marked a fundamental shift in Horde prisoner policies that reflected broader changes in organizational culture and strategic priorities. Thrall's vision of honorable warfare had created restraints on prisoner treatment that served both practical and ideological purposes, maintaining Horde credibility with neutral factions while demonstrating that Orcish society had evolved beyond the mindless brutality that had characterized earlier conflicts. Garrosh's approach eliminated these restraints in favor of policies that prioritized immediate military effectiveness over long-term strategic considerations. Prisoners were increasingly viewed as obstacles to victory rather than resources to be managed, and their treatment reflected this fundamental change in perspective. Interrogation techniques became more aggressive. Medical care was reduced to minimal levels required to maintain consciousness, and the honor-based protections that had previously shielded brave enemies from excessive abuse were systematically dismantled. The shift was gradual at first, implemented through changes in military regulations that gave field commanders greater discretion in prisoner management without explicitly authorizing war crimes. But the cumulative effect was to create an environment where casual brutality became normalized and individual acts of cruelty were rationalized as necessary measures for achieving strategic objectives. I witnessed this transformation during my third and final period of Horde captivity, when changing political conditions led to policies that would have been unthinkable under previous leadership. Prisoners who attempted escape were executed publicly as examples to their fellow captives. Those who refused to cooperate during interrogation were subjected to torture techniques that were designed to maximize suffering rather than extract information. Medical care was withheld from wounded prisoners until they agreed to provide intelligence about alliance, defensive positions, and troop movements. The honor codes that had previously protected brave enemies were reinterpreted to justify increasingly severe treatment of prisoners who were reclassified as cowards or criminals rather than legitimate combatants. Alliance soldiers who had fought according to accepted rules of warfare found themselves accused of violating Orcish military traditions they had never heard of, then punished for infractions that existed only in the imagination of their captors. The psychological impact of these policy changes extended far beyond their immediate effects on individual prisoners. Horde soldiers who had once taken pride in treating enemies with respect began to view cruelty as a measure of loyalty to their leadership. Guard units competed to demonstrate their commitment to new policies through increasingly creative applications of approved punishment techniques. Medical personnel abandoned healing traditions in favor of experiments that served military research objectives while causing maximum suffering to their subjects. But the most disturbing aspect of Garrosh's prisoner policies was not their immediate brutality, but their systematic destruction of cultural traditions that had previously provided moral foundations for Horde society. The honor codes that had distinguished noble warriors from common thugs were eliminated in favor of efficiency standards that measured success only in terms of military outcomes. Spiritual practices that had connected individual actions to larger ethical frameworks were replaced by ideological indoctrination that justified any means necessary to achieve victory over alliance forces. The transformation was so complete that veteran Horde soldiers who had served under previous leadership began to question their own memories of more civilized practices. Had prisoner treatment always been this brutal, and had they simply become soft through exposure to Alliance propaganda? Were the honor codes they remembered actually signs of weakness that had prevented the Horde from achieving victories that should have been easily within reach? Had their previous respect for enemy courage been naive sentimentality that served no practical purpose in modern warfare? These questions revealed the deeper purpose behind Garrosh's prisoner policies, which were designed not just to extract information or break enemy morale, but to reshape Horde military culture in ways that would support more aggressive strategic objectives. By normalizing cruelty toward helpless enemies, these policies created psychological conditioning that made Horde soldiers more willing to commit atrocities against civilian populations and neutral factions who might otherwise have remained outside the scope of military operations. The systematic destruction of honor traditions served similar purposes, eliminating cultural restraints that might have limited the scope of military actions or created sympathy for enemy perspectives. Soldiers who could torture prisoners without experiencing moral conflict were also capable of destroying Alliance settlements without worrying about innocent casualties. Warriors who viewed enemy courage as irrelevant were less likely to develop respect for Alliance fighting capabilities that might undermine their confidence in ultimate Horde victory. By the time Garrosh's leadership ended, prisoner treatment had become a tool for reshaping Horde society itself, rather than simply managing enemy captives. The techniques developed for breaking Alliance prisoners were eventually applied to Horde dissidents who questioned new policies or maintained loyalty to older traditions. The systematic cruelty that had once been reserved for foreign enemies became an instrument of internal control that ensured compliance with increasingly radical strategic objectives. The legacy of these changes outlasted Garrosh's tenure in ways that continued to influence Horde prisoner policies long after his removal from power. Soldiers who had been trained to view cruelty as loyalty found it difficult to readjust to more moderate approaches when leadership changed again. Cultural traditions that had been systematically destroyed could not be restored simply through changes in official policy. The psychological conditioning that had made atrocities possible remained embedded in military culture, even when explicit authorization for such actions was withdrawn. Understanding these dynamics required recognizing that prisoner treatment was never simply about managing enemy captives, but about defining the moral boundaries within which military organizations operated. The techniques used to break enemy prisoners inevitably shaped the character of the soldiers who applied them, creating feedback loops between institutional policies and individual psychology that influenced behavior in ways that extended far beyond immediate military objectives. The Horde's approach to prisoner treatment revealed fundamental truths about how warfare changes the societies that engage in it, and how the methods used against enemies eventually transform those who employ them. What began as pragmatic policies for managing captured Alliance personnel evolved into instruments for reshaping Horde culture itself, with consequences that affected every aspect of their society rather than just their military operations. My understanding of prisoner treatment in warfare changed fundamentally when I encountered the forces that existed beyond the conventional boundaries of Alliance and Horde conflict. These were not rival civilizations with different cultural approaches to honor and cruelty, but entities whose very existence challenged basic assumptions about what it meant to be human, what it meant to suffer, and what it meant to die. The first time I witnessed Scourge prisoner management was during the Third War, when my intelligence duties brought me into contact with refugee camps filled with survivors who had escaped from territories under Lich King control. Their accounts of captivity described experiences so far beyond normal human understanding that Alliance Command initially dismissed them as trauma-induced hallucinations or enemy propaganda designed to spread terror among civilian populations. But the consistency of these reports, combined with physical evidence that could not be explained through conventional warfare, gradually forced recognition that the Scourge approached prisoner treatment from perspectives that had nothing to do with military strategy or cultural tradition. Their methods were designed not to extract information or break enemy morale, but to explore the fundamental nature of consciousness itself through systematic destruction of everything that made individual existence meaningful. Scourge facilities did not house prisoners in any sense that living beings could comprehend. Instead, they maintained what survivors called laboratories of despair, vast complexes where captured enemies were subjected to experiments that tested the limits of psychological endurance before physical death. The goal was not to kill quickly, or even to cause maximum suffering, but to map the precise boundaries between sanity and madness, between individual identity and complete dissolution of self. I interviewed a night elf druid named Therul Nightwhisper, who had spent 6 weeks in Scourge custody before managing an escape that he attributed to pure chance rather than personal skill or courage. His description of the experience required hours of careful questioning to piece together, because his memories had been systematically altered to create gaps and inconsistencies that made coherent narrative almost impossible. They did not ask questions, he explained in a voice that carried no emotion despite describing events that should have been traumatic beyond endurance. They simply observed our reactions to various forms of stimulation: physical pain, psychological pressure, spiritual violation, magical manipulation. Everything was documented with scientific precision, but there was no purpose beyond the documentation itself. The Scourge had developed techniques for separating consciousness from physical death, maintaining awareness in subjects long after their bodies had ceased to function through conventional biological processes. Prisoners were kept alive through necromantic magic that sustained brain function while allowing systematic destruction of other organ systems, creating states of existence that could not be called life, but were too conscious to be considered death. These living corpses retained full awareness of their condition while being completely helpless to affect their circumstances in any way. They could think, remember, experience emotion, and suffer psychological anguish, but they could not speak, move, or communicate their experiences to others. They existed in perfect isolation within bodies that had become prisons more absolute than any physical confinement could ever be. The duration of these experiments varied according to research objectives that were never explained to the subjects, but Therul estimated that some prisoners had been maintained in these states for months, or possibly years before their consciousness was finally allowed to dissolve into the mindless undeath that characterized most Scourge soldiers. The transition from aware suffering to oblivious servitude was presented as a form of mercy, the final gift offered to subjects who had provided sufficient data for ongoing research projects. But even this mercy was arbitrary, granted or withheld according to criteria that seemed designed to maximize psychological torture among remaining subjects rather than serve any practical research purpose. Prisoners were forced to watch fellow captives receive release through final death, while remaining uncertain whether their own suffering would ever end through similar means. The randomness was itself a form of torture, creating hope and despair in carefully calibrated cycles that broke down psychological defenses more effectively than any conventional interrogation technique. Subjects learned that cooperation, resistance, pleading, and defiance all produced identical results, eliminating any sense of personal agency that might have provided psychological protection against complete dissolution of identity. What made Scourge prisoner treatment truly horrifying was not its cruelty, but its complete divorce from any human motivation or comprehensible purpose. Traditional torture served specific objectives: extracting information, breaking enemy morale, satisfying personal sadism, demonstrating power to potential opponents. Scourge methods served none of these functions. existing purely as expressions of intellectual curiosity about the nature of consciousness and suffering. The Lich King's interest in prisoner experimentation stemmed from his own condition as a consciousness trapped within an artificial construct, dependent on magical energies and necromantic bindings that could be disrupted or destroyed by enemies who understood their nature. His research into the boundaries of awareness was ultimately self-serving, designed to develop methods for protecting his own consciousness from attacks that might threaten his existence. But the practical application of this research created suffering on scales that defied human comprehension, with individual prisoners serving as test subjects for experiments that might yield results applicable to the Lich King's personal survival requirements. Their agony was simply data to be collected and analyzed, their destruction merely the cost of advancing scientific understanding that served no purpose beyond the perpetuation of an unnatural existence. My encounters with Burning Legion prisoner treatment came during the invasion of Azeroth, when demonic forces briefly established holding facilities for captured defenders who possessed knowledge or abilities that might be useful for their conquest objectives. These experiences taught me that there were forms of violation worse than the complete destruction of individual consciousness, states of existence where the self remained intact, but was forced to serve purposes that contradicted every value it had ever held. Demonic corruption worked through gradual transformation rather than sudden conversion, slowly altering prisoner psychology through exposure to energies that rewrote fundamental aspects of personality and motivation. The process was designed to maintain the appearance of voluntary cooperation while eliminating actual free will, creating servants who genuinely believed they were choosing to serve Legion interests rather than being compelled to do so. I observed this transformation in several Alliance officers who were captured during the initial demonic assault and held for what Legion commanders called integration processing. The procedure involved sustained exposure to fell energies that gradually corrupted their spiritual essence while leaving their memories and intellectual capabilities intact. They remained recognizably themselves in terms of knowledge, skills, and personal history, but their values and loyalties underwent systematic revision that eventually made them enthusiastic advocates for demonic victory. The corruption was so subtle that the affected individuals never recognized what was happening to them. They experienced their changing attitudes as natural evolution of their understanding, rather than external manipulation of their fundamental nature. Alliance officers who had devoted their lives to protecting human civilization began to view demonic conquest as beneficial for the long-term development of mortal races. Paladins who had sworn sacred oaths to defend the innocent started arguing that Legion rule would eliminate the conflicts and suffering that characterized independent civilizations. These converted prisoners became more valuable to Legion objectives than any military intelligence they might have possessed, serving as living demonstrations of demonic benevolence that could be displayed to other captives or resistant populations. Their genuine belief in the righteousness of their new loyalties made them far more convincing than coerced propaganda could ever be, and their detailed knowledge of Alliance capabilities made them ideal instruments for undermining organized resistance. The most disturbing aspect of demonic corruption was its irreversibility through conventional means. Unlike magical compulsion or psychological conditioning that could be detected and potentially countered through appropriate intervention, fell corruption altered the fundamental spiritual essence of its victims in ways that made restoration of their original nature impossible without destroying them completely. Liberation forces who encountered these converted prisoners faced impossible choices between accepting their transformation as permanent or attempting purification rituals that would eliminate the corruption by eliminating the consciousness that had been corrupted. Either option meant that the individuals they had known were lost forever, replaced by either willing servants of evil or empty shells purged of everything that had made them unique. The influence of old gods on prisoner treatment throughout Azeroth's history operated on timescales and through mechanisms that made conventional understanding of captivity completely inadequate. These ancient entities did not capture enemies in any physical sense, but rather infected them with whispers and visions that gradually transformed loyal servants of various factions into unwitting agents of cosmic horror. Old god corruption worked through dreams and hallucinations that seemed to come from external sources, but actually originated from seeds of madness implanted during moments of psychological vulnerability. Prisoners held by cultists who served these entities were subjected to rituals designed to open their minds to influences that existed outside normal reality, creating permanent connections to sources of alien knowledge and motivation. I encountered several individuals who had been exposed to old god corruption during their captivity and subsequently released through prisoner exchanges or successful escape attempts. Their accounts of the experience were fragmentary and often contradictory, reflecting the difficulty of describing encounters with forms of existence that human language was never designed to accommodate. One former prisoner, a human mage named Catherine Dawnforge, who had been held by Twilight cult forces for 3 months, described her captivity as occurring simultaneously in the physical world and in dream realms that seemed more real than normal waking consciousness. During her imprisonment, she had been forced to participate in rituals that opened portals to dimensions where the old gods maintained their imprisoned consciousness, exposing her to direct contact with entities whose mere existence challenged basic assumptions about reality. The whispers started immediately, she explained during our interview, though her eyes never focused on my face while she spoke. Not voices exactly, but something that bypassed hearing entirely and spoke directly to parts of my mind I never knew existed. They showed me things that had happened in the past, things that would happen in the future, things that were happening in other realities where different choices had been made. The knowledge gained through these exposures was simultaneously invaluable and completely useless, providing insights into cosmic truths that were too vast for human minds to process without losing their fundamental sanity. Catherine had learned details about the structure of reality that allowed her to predict certain future events with uncanny accuracy. But this prescience came at the cost of her ability to distinguish between what was real and what was simply possible across infinite variations of existence. Her psychological condition deteriorated steadily following her release, as the alien knowledge in her mind continued to expand and develop according to its own incomprehensible logic. Alliance mental healers were unable to provide effective treatment because the symptoms resulted from genuine contact with cosmic forces rather than simple trauma or magical influence that could be countered through conventional intervention. The Twilight cult's approach to prisoner treatment reflected their role as intermediaries between human understanding and old god consciousness, creating conditions that facilitated contact between mortal minds and alien entities while attempting to preserve enough individual sanity to make the resulting corruption useful for their strategic objectives. Their methods combined elements of traditional interrogation with ritualistic practices designed to break down psychological barriers that normally protected human consciousness from external influences. Prisoners were kept in chambers where the boundaries between reality and hallucination were deliberately blurred through exposure to magical energies that distorted perception and eliminated reliable reference points for determining what was actually happening. Sleep deprivation was combined with sensory overload to create states of consciousness where normal cognitive defenses became unreliable and alien influences could establish permanent footholds in human minds. The conversion process was gradual but irreversible, transforming loyal servants of various factions into individuals whose ultimate loyalties belonged to entities that existed outside normal reality. These converted prisoners retained their original personalities and memories, but their fundamental motivations were gradually realigned to serve purposes that often conflicted with their conscious beliefs and stated principles. Iron Horde prisoner treatment from the alternate timeline represented a fascinating case study in how temporal manipulation could affect traditional approaches to captivity and control. When these alternate versions of familiar faces arrived in our reality through the dark portal, they brought with them prisoner management techniques that reflected technological advancement combined with cultural regression that created unique forms of suffering. The Iron Horde had developed mechanical restraints and containment systems that were far more sophisticated than anything available to our timeline's version of Horde technology. But they applied these innovations according to cultural values that emphasized personal glory and tribal dominance over the honor codes that had evolved in our reality through decades of contact with other civilizations. The result was prisoner treatment that combined technological efficiency with primitive brutality in ways that seemed designed to maximize both physical suffering and psychological humiliation. Their prison facilities featured automated systems for monitoring prisoner health and adjusting environmental conditions to maintain optimal levels of discomfort without causing death or permanent incapacitation. Magical enhancement of conventional torture techniques allowed precise control over pain levels and duration of suffering, creating standardized procedures for breaking prisoner resistance that could be applied consistently regardless of individual psychological profiles. But these technological sophistications were paired with ritualistic elements that reflected Iron Horde cultural obsession with demonstrating dominance over defeated enemies. Prisoners were forced to participate in ceremonies that celebrated their capture and humiliation, required to acknowledge the superiority of their captors through formal recitations that were recorded and distributed among Iron Horde forces as morale-building propaganda. The combination of advanced technology with primitive cultural values created prisoner treatment that was somehow more dehumanizing than either approach would have been independently. The technological elements eliminated opportunities for personal connection between prisoners and guards that might have provided psychological protection against complete despair. The ritualistic elements reduced individual suffering to components of larger performances designed to serve political and cultural objectives rather than practical military needs. Naga slavery systems represented perhaps the most systematically oppressive approach to prisoner treatment that I encountered during my years studying captivity across different civilizations. Unlike other factions that viewed prisoners as temporary problems to be solved through interrogation, exchange, or execution, the Naga had developed elaborate social hierarchies based on the permanent enslavement of surface dwellers who possessed useful skills or knowledge. Their underwater prison facilities were engineering marvels that maintained breathable environments for air-breathing captives while ensuring that escape was impossible without magical assistance that was strictly controlled by Naga overseers. Prisoners were classified according to their potential value as long-term assets, then assigned to work details or breeding programs designed to produce subsequent generations of slaves with enhanced capabilities. The psychological impact of permanent enslavement was managed through careful manipulation of hope and despair, with prisoners allowed to believe that exceptional service might eventually earn them improved conditions or even freedom, while ensuring that such rewards were never actually granted. This created stable populations of captive workers who remained productive for years or decades while maintaining enough psychological resilience to avoid the complete breakdown that would have made them useless as laborers. Naga reproduction biology allowed them to maintain slave populations through generations without requiring constant replenishment from new captures. creating stable communities of surface dwellers who had been born into captivity and knew no other existence. These hereditary slaves often proved more loyal to their Naga masters than to surface civilizations they had never experienced, serving as administrators and overseers within the slavery system that maintained their own oppression. Centaur prisoner treatment reflected their nomadic culture and their history of conflict with more settled civilizations, combining practical needs for managing captives during constant movement with cultural traditions that emphasize the temporary nature of all social relationships. Prisoners were integrated into Centaur society as temporary slaves whose status could change based on demonstrated courage, useful skills, or simple luck in surviving long enough to prove their worth. The Centaur approach to captivity was perhaps more honest than other systems in its acknowledgement that prisoner treatment was fundamentally arbitrary, dependent on the whims and immediate needs of individual tribe leaders, rather than consistent policies or cultural values. This arbitrariness created its own form of psychological pressure, as prisoners could never predict what actions would improve or worsen their circumstances. But the same arbitrariness also created opportunities for advancement that were absent from more systematic approaches to prisoner management. Captives who demonstrated exceptional courage, useful knowledge, or simple entertainment value could find themselves adopted into Centaur tribes as full members rather than permanent slaves. The possibility of such advancement, however remote, provided psychological protection against complete despair that helped maintain prisoner morale even under harsh conditions. Neutral faction approaches to prisoner treatment, particularly among organizations like the Argent Dawn and Cenarion Circle, represented attempts to maintain civilized standards of captivity even when dealing with enemies whose own methods had abandoned all pretense of honor or mercy. These groups faced unique challenges in balancing their moral principles against practical needs for obtaining intelligence and protecting their own members from retaliation. The Argent Dawn's prisoner policies were based on religious principles that emphasized the possibility of redemption, even for individuals who had committed terrible acts in service of evil masters. Their holding facilities provided medical care, spiritual counseling, and opportunities for genuine conversion that could lead to integration into the organization rather than simple release or execution. But maintaining such idealistic standards required constant vigilance against corruption by the very enemies they sought to redeem, and several incidents demonstrated the dangers of showing mercy to individuals who retained loyalty to dark masters despite apparent conversion. The balance between charitable treatment and practical security created ongoing moral dilemmas that had no easy solutions and often forced difficult choices between competing ethical obligations. The Cenarion Circle's approach emphasized healing and restoration rather than punishment or conversion, treating captured enemies as victims of corruption who needed treatment rather than criminals who deserved suffering. Their druids possessed magical abilities that could detect and counter many forms of spiritual corruption, making them uniquely qualified to distinguish between genuine conversion and elaborate deception. These forgotten wars revealed the fundamental inadequacy of conventional approaches to prisoner treatment when dealing with enemies whose goals, methods, and basic nature transcended normal understanding of conflict and cooperation. The rules that governed civilized warfare became meaningless when applied to entities that existed outside the moral frameworks that had created those rules, forcing all participants to choose between abandoning their principles or accepting defeat by enemies who recognized no limits on acceptable behavior. The true cost of how prisoners are treated in war cannot be measured in statistics or military effectiveness reports. It lives in the individual stories of those who survived captivity, in the children who grew up knowing only confinement, in the families torn apart by decisions made in distant command centers by people who never saw the faces of those whose lives they were destroying. During my years moving between different prison systems, I collected these stories not as intelligence data, but as fragments of human experience that revealed truths too painful for official histories to acknowledge. The most famous prisoner in all of Azeroth's recent history never knew he was a prisoner at all, at least not in the beginning. Thrall's childhood in Durnhold Keep represents everything that is both sophisticated and horrifying about long-term captivity designed to reshape identity rather than simply extract information or break resistance. Lieutenant General Aedelus Blackmore understood that the most effective prison is one where the captive believes they are free, where the bars are made of carefully constructed reality rather than iron or stone. I had access to detailed records of Thrall's imprisonment through my intelligence work, documents that revealed the systematic psychological manipulation involved in what Blackmore called his education, but what any objective observer would recognize as perhaps the most elaborate prisoner conditioning program ever implemented by human authority. Every aspect of the young orc's environment was carefully controlled to produce specific psychological outcomes that would serve his captor's long-term strategic objectives. Thrall was allowed to believe he was unique, the only orc capable of rational thought and civilized behavior, while being systematically isolated from any information about his own people's actual culture, history, or capabilities. This isolation was paired with constant reinforcement of human superiority and orcish savagery, creating a fundamental identity confusion that made him psychologically dependent on his captors for basic understanding of his place in the world. The sophistication of this approach impressed even experienced intelligence professionals who studied the case in later years. Blackmore had created conditions where his prisoner voluntarily cooperated with his own imprisonment because he genuinely believed that life outside Durnhold would mean reverting to the mindless brutality that characterized his race. The physical restraints that had confined Thrall as a child were gradually replaced by psychological barriers that were far more effective because they were maintained by the prisoner's own beliefs rather than external force. What made this case particularly disturbing was its long-term effectiveness, even after Thrall discovered the truth about his imprisonment and escaped to rejoin his own people. The psychological conditioning he had undergone during his formative years continued to influence his behavior and decision-making throughout his adult life, creating personality traits and behavioral patterns that served human interests even when he was actively working to advance orcish objectives. Thrall's emphasis on honor, his instinctive respect for human political institutions, his preference for negotiation over warfare, his commitment to integration with existing power structures rather than revolutionary change. All of these characteristics could be traced back to the careful psychological programming he had undergone during his years as Blackmore's prize specimen. He had become exactly what his captor intended, an orc leader who would guide his people toward accepting subordinate status within a human-dominated political order. The irony was that Thrall never fully recognized how completely his imprisonment had shaped his fundamental worldview. He believed his moderate policies reflected wisdom and maturity rather than the lingering effects of childhood indoctrination, designed to make him a more manageable leader for a potentially dangerous population. His greatest victories as war chief could be understood as successful implementations of strategies that ultimately served human strategic interests, rather than genuine orcish liberation. But Thrall's story also demonstrated the unpredictable nature of long-term psychological manipulation, because the same conditioning that was designed to make him a compliant puppet also provided him with intellectual tools and cultural understanding that he eventually used to challenge the assumptions underlying his captivity. His escape from Durnhold was possible only because his education had given him knowledge of human weaknesses and institutional vulnerabilities that most Orc prisoners would never have possessed. The case of Garona Halforsen revealed different aspects of how captivity could reshape individual identity across multiple cycles of imprisonment and release. Her mixed heritage made her valuable to various factions as both prisoner and agent, creating a cycle of capture, conditioning, liberation, and recapture that gradually destroyed her ability to maintain any coherent sense of personal identity or factional loyalty. I interviewed Garona during a brief period when she was held by Alliance intelligence services, and her account of repeated captivity by different organizations revealed the cumulative psychological damage that resulted from being treated as a strategic asset rather than a person with inherent rights and dignity. Each faction that held her had used sophisticated conditioning techniques to ensure her loyalty while she served their objectives. But these competing programs of psychological manipulation had created internal conflicts that made stable identity formation impossible. She described her experience as living inside a series of masks that had been constructed by her various captors, each one designed to serve specific purposes, but none of them reflecting her actual personality or desires. The Gul'dan's Shadow Council had conditioned her to serve Orcish interests through magical compulsion that bypassed conscious choice entirely. Alliance intelligence had used more subtle techniques to redirect her loyalties while maintaining the illusion that she was acting according to her own free will. The old gods' servants had exposed her to whispers that planted motivations she couldn't distinguish from her own thoughts. The result was a form of psychological fragmentation that made meaningful personal relationships impossible because she could never be certain whether her feelings toward others were genuine or artificial, whether her memories of past events were accurate or had been altered to serve someone else's agenda. She had become a living weapon that could be activated by any faction that understood the conditioning protocols used by previous captors. But she had ceased to exist as an independent person with authentic emotions and desires. What made Garona's case particularly tragic was her awareness of her own condition combined with her complete inability to do anything about it. She knew that her mind had been repeatedly violated by various forms of magical and psychological manipulation, but the same violations that had created this knowledge had also eliminated her capacity to trust her own perceptions, enough to distinguish between genuine thoughts and implanted programming. Her relationship with her son Medan illustrated how the effects of prolonged captivity extended beyond individual prisoners to affect subsequent generations in ways that created ongoing cycles of psychological damage and factional conflict. Medan had inherited both his mother's mixed heritage and her psychological instability, making him simultaneously valuable and dangerous to every major faction in ways that ensured his own life would be defined by captivity and manipulation rather than normal development. The story of Prince Anduin Rin's multiple kidnappings revealed how prisoner treatment could be used as a weapon against entire political systems through the systematic exploitation of familial bonds and emotional vulnerabilities. Each faction that captured the young prince understood that his value lay not in any information he possessed or any direct threat he represented, but in his capacity to influence the behavior of Alliance leadership through the psychological pressure his captivity created. The Defiers Brotherhood's abduction of Anduin was relatively straightforward in its objectives and methods, designed to force political concessions from Stormwind leadership through the threat of harm to someone they valued above any strategic consideration. But subsequent kidnappings by more sophisticated enemies revealed how prisoner treatment could be used to achieve far more complex objectives than simple political blackmail. Garrosh's capture of Anduin during the conflict in Pandaria represented an attempt to use prolonged captivity to gradually convert the future King of Stormwind into an unwitting advocate for Horde interests. The conditioning process was subtle and patient, designed to create positive associations with Orcish culture and values, while gradually undermining his confidence in Alliance leadership and policies. Anduin was exposed to carefully selected aspects of Horde society that emphasized honor, courage, and spiritual depth, while being systematically isolated from information about Orcish war crimes or aggressive policies that might have hardened his resistance to psychological manipulation. His captors presented themselves as reluctant warriors forced into conflict by Alliance aggression, rather than willing participants in expansionist campaigns designed to eliminate human civilization. The long-term objective was to ensure that when Anduin eventually became king, his policies would reflect unconscious biases toward accommodation with Horde demands rather than principled resistance to Orcish territorial ambitions. Even if the conditioning was never complete enough to make him a willing collaborator, it might create sufficient uncertainty about the righteousness of Alliance positions to prevent effective resistance to future Horde expansion. But Anduin's youth and relative innocence actually provided psychological protection against some forms of manipulation that would have been effective against more experienced prisoners. His limited understanding of political complexities made it difficult for his captors to exploit sophisticated ideological arguments, while his genuine compassion for all forms of suffering made him resistant to attempts to demonize Alliance enemies or justify Orcish brutality. The Children of War represent perhaps the most tragic category of prisoners, because their captivity often began before they were old enough to understand what was happening to them or why they were being separated from their families. These child prisoners grew up in environments where captivity was normal, and freedom was an abstract concept rather than a lived experience that they could remember and hope to recover. I encountered numerous children during my years studying prison systems across different factions, and their stories revealed the devastating long-term effects of growing up in captivity on psychological development and identity formation. Children who spent their formative years as prisoners often developed personality traits and behavioral patterns that made successful integration into normal society impossible even after their eventual release. The orphans from Shatrath City, who were captured during various conflicts and raised in different faction prisoner facilities, demonstrated how childhood captivity could be used to create adults whose loyalties belonged entirely to their captors rather than their birth communities. These children had no memory of their original families or cultures, knowing only the prison environments where they had been raised and the value systems that had been imposed on them through years of systematic conditioning. Some of these children grew up to become effective agents for the factions that had captured them, their complete psychological integration making them far more valuable than adult prisoners who retained memories of alternative loyalties and identities. They could be deployed in intelligence operations against their birth communities without experiencing the internal conflicts that made other converted prisoners unreliable or psychologically unstable. But many others never developed the psychological resilience necessary for effective adult functioning, becoming permanent institutional dependents who required constant supervision and support throughout their lives. The same conditioning that eliminated their connection to original identities also prevented them from forming stable relationships or pursuing independent goals that might have provided meaning and purpose to their existence. The practice of taking children as prisoners created political complications that extended far beyond immediate military objectives, because the long-term effects of such policies inevitably influenced subsequent diplomatic relationships and peace negotiations. Communities that had experienced systematic child abduction found it difficult to trust peace agreements that did not include provisions for accountability and reparations related to these violations. Prisoner exchanges represented one of the few areas where different factions maintained diplomatic contact, even during periods of active warfare, creating opportunities for negotiation and compromise that might eventually lead to broader peace agreements. But these exchanges also revealed the complex calculations involved in determining the relative value of different individuals and the political considerations that influenced decisions about which prisoners were worth recovering and which could be sacrificed for strategic advantage. I participated in several prisoner exchange negotiations during my intelligence career, and these experiences taught me how such transactions served multiple purposes beyond the humanitarian goal of reuniting captives with their original communities. Exchange agreements provided opportunities for informal communication between enemy leadership, allowing discussion of broader political issues under the pretext of arranging practical details related to prisoner transfers. The selection process for determining which prisoners would be included in exchange agreements revealed the harsh realities of how different factions evaluated the worth of individual lives. Military officers with specialized knowledge were prioritized over common soldiers whose expertise was easily replaceable. Individuals with valuable political connections or symbolic importance received consideration that was denied to prisoners whose capture had been opportunistic rather than strategically motivated. These calculations created lasting resentment among prisoners who were excluded from exchange agreements, many of whom eventually concluded that their own governments had written them off as expendable assets rather than valued citizens deserving rescue. The psychological impact of such abandonment often proved more damaging than the physical hardships of continued captivity, creating permanent alienation from home communities, even among prisoners who eventually gained freedom through other means. Escape attempts represented perhaps the most dangerous aspect of prisoner experience because they forced direct confrontation between individual determination and institutional authority in situations where failure meant consequences far worse than continued compliance with existing conditions. The decision to attempt escape required careful calculation of risks and opportunities combined with psychological preparation for outcomes that might include torture, execution, or indefinitely prolonged captivity under harsher conditions. I witnessed several escape attempts during my own periods of captivity and learned that success depended less on individual courage or skill than on favorable circumstances that were largely beyond prisoner control. The most successful escapes involved careful coordination between multiple prisoners combined with assistance from external allies who could provide resources and support that were impossible to obtain from within prison facilities. But even successful escapes often created problems that extended far beyond immediate liberation from captivity. Escaped prisoners carried knowledge of security procedures and facility layouts that made them valuable intelligence assets, but they also represented security risks that required constant protection from recapture attempts by their former captors. The psychological stress of living under permanent threat of re-imprisonment often proved as damaging as the original captivity experience. The long-term psychological effects of captivity manifested differently in prisoners and guards, but both groups experienced lasting changes in personality and behavior that influenced their relationships and life choices for years or decades after their involvement in prison systems ended. Prisoners developed hypervigilance and trust issues that made normal social relationships difficult to maintain. Guards experienced desensitization to suffering that affected their capacity for empathy and emotional connection with family members and friends. I observed these effects in myself as well as in others, recognizing gradual changes in my own personality and worldview that resulted from prolonged exposure to systematic cruelty and psychological manipulation. The knowledge I had gained about the true nature of factional conflicts and the methods used to control prisoner populations had made it impossible for me to maintain the naive optimism about human nature and institutional integrity that had characterized my earlier perspective on war and politics. Stockholm Syndrome and prisoner conversion represented the most complex psychological phenomena associated with long-term captivity, involving genuine changes in prisoner loyalty and identity that served captor interests while providing psychological protection against complete despair. These conversions were often dismissed as temporary responses to stress that would disappear once prisoners returned to normal environments. But my observations suggested that many such changes were permanent alterations in fundamental personality and value systems. The effectiveness of conversion techniques varied significantly based on individual psychological profiles and the sophistication of conditioning methods employed by different factions. Prisoners with strong ideological commitments or clear understanding of political conflicts were generally more resistant to conversion attempts, while those captured during confusing situations or individuals with limited education about broader strategic issues proved more susceptible to systematic manipulation. These individual stories revealed truths about the human cost of prisoner treatment that could never be captured in official reports or strategic assessments. Behind every policy decision and operational procedure were real people whose lives had been permanently altered by experiences they never chose and consequences they could not have anticipated. Understanding these stories was essential for comprehending the full implications of how different civilizations chose to treat their captives, because the methods used to break enemy prisoners inevitably reflected and shaped the character of the societies that employed them. The evolution of prisoner treatment across the decades of conflict that have defined modern Azeroth reveals a pattern of gradual degradation that mirrors the broader transformation of warfare itself, from contests between rival civilizations to desperate struggles for species survival against cosmic threats that challenge the fundamental nature of reality. What began as conflicts governed by traditional codes of honor and mercy has gradually descended into forms of brutality that would have been unthinkable to the warriors who fought in earlier wars. During the First War between humans and orcs, prisoner treatment on both sides reflected cultural traditions that emphasized individual valor and respect for worthy opponents. Human knights who captured orc warriors often allowed them honorable deaths through single combat, rather than subjecting them to prolonged imprisonment or interrogation. Orc clans that took human prisoners frequently offered them opportunities to prove their courage through trials that could earn them adoption into the clan, rather than permanent enslavement. These practices were rooted in worldviews that understood warfare as a contest between equals, with both sides operating according to similar assumptions about honor, courage, and the appropriate treatment of defeated enemies. The conflicts were certainly brutal, but they remained comprehensible in human terms, fought for territorial control and cultural dominance, rather than existential survival against forces that sought to eliminate consciousness itself. I studied documents from this period that revealed how military commanders on both sides struggled to develop policies for managing prisoners whose cultural backgrounds were completely alien, but whose basic humanity remained recognizable. Human officers described orc captives as savage but courageous, noting their loyalty to clan bonds and their willingness to die rather than betray important military secrets. Orc war leaders spoke of human prisoners with grudging respect for their tactical innovation and their dedication to abstract principles that transcended immediate clan loyalty. The mutual recognition of shared warrior values created opportunities for communication and understanding that influenced prisoner treatment in ways that served both practical and ethical purposes. Prisoners who demonstrated courage under interrogation were often granted better treatment as acknowledgement of their personal honor. Enemy wounded received medical attention because allowing brave warriors to die from treatable injuries was seen as wasteful rather than strategic. But the Second War marked the beginning of a transformation that would gradually erode these traditional restraints as both factions encountered enemies whose methods and objectives challenged basic assumptions about the nature of conflict itself. The arrival of the Burning Legion on Azeroth introduced forms of warfare that had no precedent in previous human or Orcish experience, forcing rapid adaptation to threats that conventional military doctrine was completely unprepared to address. Demonic possession of enemy commanders created situations where traditional prisoner exchanges became impossible because the individuals being released were no longer the same people who had been captured. Alliance officers who had been taken prisoner by demon-corrupted forces often returned as sleeper agents whose fundamental loyalties had been altered through exposure to fill energies that rewrote their spiritual essence. These experiences forced development of screening procedures and containment protocols that treated returning prisoners as potential threats rather than liberated allies. The necessity of defending against supernatural corruption gradually changed how both factions approached prisoner management, introducing magical restraints and detection methods that had never been required for purely physical captivity. Specialized personnel trained in recognizing signs of demonic influence became essential components of military organizations that had previously relied on conventional security measures to prevent escape attempts and intelligence breaches. These technological and procedural innovations served immediate practical needs, but they also established precedents for treating prisoners as inherently dangerous rather than temporarily defeated enemies who retained basic rights to humane treatment. The techniques developed for containing demon-corrupted captives were eventually applied to ordinary prisoners whose only crime was serving enemy factions, creating systematic dehumanization that made increasingly brutal treatment seem justified by security requirements. The Third War accelerated this process by introducing the Scourge as a threat that eliminated any meaningful distinction between military combatants and civilian populations, forcing all surviving factions to adopt survival strategies that prioritized species preservation over traditional ethical constraints. The undead armies of the Lich King demonstrated that enemy prisoners could be converted into weapons that retained their original knowledge and capabilities while serving completely hostile objectives. This revelation transformed prisoner management from a logistical challenge into an existential threat that required extreme measures to prevent captured personnel from becoming additional enemies rather than simply sources of intelligence or political leverage. Alliance and Horde commanders began authorizing execution of prisoners whose strategic value was deemed insufficient to justify the risk of their eventual conversion to undead servants who would carry detailed knowledge of friendly capabilities and vulnerabilities. The systematic abandonment of prisoner protection protocols during the Third War created precedents that influenced policy development for decades afterward, establishing emergency powers and exceptional procedures that remained in effect long after the immediate threats that had justified their implementation had been resolved. Military organizations that had adopted extreme measures as temporary responses to supernatural dangers found it difficult to return to more moderate approaches when confronting conventional enemies who posed no comparable existential threats. The influence of Titans and Old Gods on Azerothian civilization created additional complications for prisoner treatment by introducing cosmic perspectives that reduced individual suffering to statistical noise in calculations that encompassed millions of years and entire planetary populations. Titan constructs and Old God servants operated according to moral frameworks that had no meaningful connection to human concepts of justice or mercy, forcing mortal civilizations to develop responses that were equally divorced from traditional ethical constraints. I observed this transformation firsthand during conflicts involving Titan-forged enemies whose prisoner treatment policies reflected their artificial nature and programmed objectives rather than emotional responses to suffering or cultural traditions that valued individual dignity. These constructs processed captured enemies according to efficiency calculations that optimized resource allocation without consideration for psychological welfare or long-term political consequences that might result from excessively harsh treatment. The clinical detachment with which Titan-forged forces managed their captives gradually influenced mortal approaches to similar problems, introducing bureaucratic procedures and standardized protocols that reduced prisoner treatment to administrative tasks rather than moral decisions requiring individual judgment and cultural sensitivity. The systematic dehumanization inherent in these approaches made it easier for military personnel to implement increasingly harsh policies without experiencing psychological conflict about their compliance with orders that violated traditional ethical principles. Old God corruption worked through subtler mechanisms that gradually altered fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality and the appropriate responses to threats that might be internal rather than external in origin. Exposure to whispers and visions from ancient entities created paranoia about prisoner reliability that justified extreme security measures and interrogation techniques designed to detect corruption that might be undetectable through conventional means. The expansion of screening procedures to identify old God influence eventually created surveillance systems that treated all prisoners as potential carriers of cosmic corruption, rather than simply enemy personnel who posed conventional security risks. These systems required increasingly invasive examination of prisoner psychology and spiritual condition, normalizing forms of mental violation that would have been considered unacceptable under previous standards of humane treatment. Cross-faction cooperation during shared threats against cosmic enemies created temporary alliances that demonstrated the possibility of maintaining civilized standards even under extreme pressure. But these collaborations also revealed how quickly such standards could be abandoned when immediate survival seemed to require compromises with fundamental moral principles. The Argent Crusade's joint operations with Horde and Alliance forces against the Scourge showed that traditional enemies could work together effectively while maintaining respect for prisoner rights and civilian protection protocols. But the same conflicts also demonstrated how cosmic threats could be used to justify policies that served factional interests rather than genuine security requirements. Military commanders who had learned to rationalize extreme measures as necessary responses to existential dangers found it easy to apply similar logic to conventional enemies whose defeat served political objectives rather than species survival. The establishment of modern prisoner exchange programs represented attempts to restore civilized standards through formal agreements that committed all parties to minimum treatment requirements and regular diplomatic contact designed to prevent the complete breakdown of humanitarian constraints. These programs achieved limited success in reducing the worst abuses while providing mechanisms for communication between enemy factions that might eventually contribute to broader peace negotiations. But the effectiveness of exchange programs was undermined by fundamental changes in the nature of warfare that made traditional prisoner categories increasingly meaningless. The proliferation of magical corruption, technological enhancement, and psychological conditioning meant that returning prisoners often posed security risks that were impossible to assess through conventional screening methods. Exchange negotiations became increasingly complex, as each faction demanded guarantees about prisoner condition and post-release behavior that were impossible to provide given the sophisticated forms of manipulation that had become standard practice in military intelligence operations. The time and resources required to verify that returning prisoners had not been compromised often exceeded the diplomatic value of maintaining formal exchange agreements. The cycle of revenge that characterized long-term conflicts between major factions created additional complications for prisoner treatment by establishing expectations of retaliation that influenced policy decisions in ways that perpetuated escalating brutality rather than encouraging moderation through mutual restraint. Each faction's treatment of enemy prisoners was shaped by their own experiences as captives, creating feedback loops that gradually normalized increasingly extreme measures. Alliance officers who had survived harsh treatment in Horde facilities often supported similar policies toward Orc prisoners as justified retaliation for violations they had personally experienced. Horde commanders who had witnessed Alliance war crimes against their own personnel felt entitled to respond with comparable brutality that honored their fallen comrades while deterring future enemy atrocities. These cycles of retaliation were reinforced by military cultures that celebrated loyalty to fallen comrades and institutional memory systems that preserved detailed accounts of enemy cruelty while minimizing documentation of friendly forces' own violations. Each generation of military personnel inherited grievances from previous conflicts that shaped their attitudes toward enemy prisoners in ways that made moderate treatment seem like betrayal of their predecessors' sacrifices. The institutional momentum toward increasingly harsh prisoner treatment was strengthened by career advancement systems that rewarded officers who demonstrated unwavering commitment to factional interests over those who showed excessive concern for enemy welfare. Military personnel who advocated for moderate prisoner policies were often viewed as lacking the moral clarity and emotional toughness required for effective leadership during wartime conditions. Technological advancement in magical restraints and containment systems provided new tools for prisoner management that were initially developed to address legitimate security concerns, but were gradually applied in ways that served convenience rather than necessity. Magical bindings that prevented spellcasting by captured enemy mages were expanded to suppress all forms of supernatural ability among prisoners, even when such abilities posed no realistic escape risk. Enchanted restraints that monitored prisoner psychological states for signs of deception or resistance were employed routinely rather than selectively, creating surveillance systems that eliminated privacy and personal autonomy in ways that served institutional control objectives rather than genuine security requirements. These technologies made it possible to maintain larger prisoner populations with fewer guards, while gathering detailed intelligence about individual psychological profiles that could be exploited for various purposes. The availability of magical monitoring systems reduced incentives for developing personal relationships between prisoners and guards that might have provided informal protection against abuse or excessive punishment. When technological systems could provide complete information about prisoner behavior and emotional states, human guards became simply enforcement mechanisms rather than individuals who might exercise discretion or show mercy based on personal judgment and cultural values. The lessons learned from decades of evolving prisoner treatment policies revealed fundamental truths about how civilizations respond to existential pressures and the mechanisms through which emergency measures become permanent features of institutional culture. The most important insight was that standards of humane treatment require constant active maintenance rather than simply formal adoption, because the natural tendency during prolonged conflict is toward increasing dehumanization of enemies. But these lessons were consistently ignored by subsequent generations of military and political leadership, who believed their own circumstances were unique enough to justify exceptions to principles that had been established through the painful experience of previous conflicts. Each new threat was presented as requiring temporary suspension of normal ethical constraints, with assurances that moderate policies would be restored once immediate dangers had been resolved. The pattern of temporary exceptions becoming permanent policies was so consistent across different conflicts and factions that it represented a fundamental characteristic of how military organizations adapt to changing threat environments, rather than simply a series of individual failures in moral leadership. Understanding this pattern was essential for recognizing that prisoner treatment policies were symptoms of broader cultural and institutional changes rather than isolated decisions that could be modified through purely administrative means. The evolution from honor to horror in prisoner treatment across Azeroth's conflicts reflected the gradual transformation of warfare itself, from contests between rival civilizations to desperate struggles against forces that threatened the fundamental nature of existence. Each escalation in brutality was justified by genuine threats that required extreme responses, but the cumulative effect was to normalize forms of cruelty that made subsequent atrocities seem reasonable by comparison. This process demonstrated that the greatest threat to civilized standards was not necessarily external enemies who rejected humanitarian principles, but the gradual erosion of internal constraints through repeated compromises with moral ideals that were deemed impractical under emergency conditions. The most effective way to destroy a civilization's commitment to humane treatment was not to attack it directly, but to create circumstances that forced repeated choices between survival and principle until the distinction between the two became meaningless. The philosophical implications of what I witnessed during my years studying prisoner treatment across Azeroth's conflicts extend far beyond military strategy or immediate humanitarian concerns. These practices reveal fundamental truths about the moral foundations of different civilizations and the mechanisms through which societies justify or condemn the suffering they inflict on their enemies. Understanding how each faction treats its captives provides insight into core values that shape every aspect of their culture, from religious beliefs to political institutions to individual concepts of honor and duty. The Alliance's approach to prisoner treatment reflected their foundational belief in the inherent dignity of all sapient beings and their commitment to legal frameworks that constrained arbitrary exercise of power even during wartime conditions. These principles derived from philosophical traditions that emphasized individual rights as natural endowments that could not be legitimately violated regardless of political circumstances or military necessity. But the practical application of these ideals revealed contradictions between stated values and actual behavior that created ongoing moral crises within Alliance institutions. Military officers who genuinely believed in human dignity found themselves implementing policies that systematically dehumanized enemy prisoners through bureaucratic procedures that reduced individual suffering to administrative statistics. Political leaders who proclaimed their commitment to justice authorized operations that violated international law while maintaining plausible deniability through institutional structures that diffused personal responsibility. The gap between Alliance ideals and Alliance practice created psychological pressure on individual personnel who were forced to choose between career advancement and moral consistency, between institutional loyalty and personal conscience, between species survival and ethical principle. These conflicts were rarely resolved through clear moral reasoning, but rather through gradual psychological adaptation that allowed individuals to rationalize increasingly questionable behavior as necessary service to higher purposes. The Alliance's prisoner treatment policies also reflected their assumptions about the possibility of moral progress through institutional reform and legal constraint. Their detailed codes of conduct and formal review procedures were based on beliefs that systematic injustice could be prevented through appropriate regulations and oversight mechanisms rather than fundamental changes in human nature or political structures. But these regulatory approaches often served to legitimize cruelty rather than prevent it, creating bureaucratic frameworks that provided legal justification for practices that violated the humanitarian principles the regulations were supposedly designed to protect. Formal procedures for prisoner interrogation and detention created illusions of civilized restraint, while enabling systematic psychological torture that was technically compliant with written policies, but completely contrary to their underlying moral intent. The Horde's treatment of prisoners reflected very different philosophical foundations that emphasized collective survival and cultural continuity over individual rights and abstract moral principles. Their approach was rooted in worldviews that understood existence as fundamentally competitive, with different groups struggling for limited resources in environments where mercy toward enemies often meant death for one's own people. This philosophical framework created prisoner policies that were often more honest about the realities of warfare while remaining committed to cultural values that provided meaning and identity to Horde society. Enemy captives were treated as defeated opponents whose fate depended on their demonstrated courage and their potential value to Horde interests. But there was no pretense that they possessed inherent rights that transcended practical considerations about collective survival. The Horde's emphasis on honor as a central organizing principle created complex moral calculations that could justify both exceptional mercy and extraordinary brutality, depending on specific circumstances and cultural evaluations of prisoner worthiness. Warriors who fought bravely were accorded respect that could earn them adoption into enemy societies, while those who violated cultural codes about appropriate military behavior could be subjected to punishment that served educational and ceremonial purposes rather than simply strategic objectives. But honor-based systems also created vulnerabilities to manipulation by enemies who understood how cultural values could be exploited to serve hostile objectives. The Horde's respect for individual courage and demonstrated competence made them susceptible to psychological operations that presented enemy agents as worthy opponents deserving of consideration rather than threats requiring immediate elimination. The moral cost of survival in a world constantly under existential threat created philosophical dilemmas that had no satisfactory resolution through traditional ethical frameworks. When the alternative to victory was not political subjugation, but complete annihilation of one's entire species or civilization, conventional restraints on acceptable behavior became meaningless abstractions that served enemy interests rather than moral imperatives. This reality forced all major factions to develop justifications for policies that violated their fundamental stated principles, while maintaining psychological frameworks that allowed individual personnel to function without complete moral breakdown. The cognitive dissonance between idealistic values and brutal necessities was managed through various psychological mechanisms that ranged from complete denial to sophisticated rationalization systems that transformed cruelty into virtue. Religious and philosophical traditions provided intellectual resources for justifying prisoner treatment policies that might otherwise have been recognized as violations of basic humanitarian principles. Alliance theology emphasized divine plans that encompassed individual suffering as necessary components of larger purposes that served ultimate good despite immediate evil. Horde shamanism spoke of spiritual balance that required destruction as well as creation, with enemy defeat serving natural cycles that maintained cosmic harmony. But these religious justifications often served political purposes rather than genuine spiritual insight, providing intellectual cover for decisions that were actually based on practical calculations about military effectiveness and factional advantage. The same theological principles that could justify mercy and restraint could also support unlimited brutality, depending on how they were interpreted by authorities whose primary concerns were strategic rather than spiritual. The role of individual choice versus institutional policy in determining prisoner treatment revealed fundamental tensions between personal moral responsibility and collective survival requirements. Individual guards, interrogators, and commanders faced daily decisions about how to implement policies that they might privately recognize as morally questionable. But these choices were constrained by institutional pressures that made resistance difficult or impossible. Most personnel resolved these conflicts by focusing on immediate duties rather than broader implications of their actions, accepting moral compartmentalization that allowed them to function effectively within systems whose overall objectives they might not personally endorse. This psychological adaptation enabled institutional continuity while distributing moral responsibility in ways that made fundamental reform extremely difficult to achieve. The few individuals who refused to comply with morally questionable orders often found themselves marginalized or eliminated from positions where they could influence policy, creating selection pressures that gradually concentrated authority among personnel who were either morally flexible or psychologically damaged enough to implement extreme measures without experiencing debilitating internal conflict. The impact of prisoner treatment on post-war reconciliation demonstrated how wartime policies created lasting obstacles to peaceful coexistence that extended far beyond immediate military objectives. Communities that had experienced systematic cruelty during captivity found it difficult to trust peace agreements that did not include mechanisms for accountability and reparations, while those who had implemented harsh policies feared retaliation that made them resistant to genuine reconciliation efforts. The psychological trauma inflicted on prisoners created ongoing cycles of resentment and revenge that influenced subsequent generations through family narratives and cultural memory systems that preserved detailed accounts of wartime suffering. Children who grew up hearing stories about enemy atrocities developed attitudes toward former adversaries that made peaceful coexistence difficult to maintain, even when political conditions favored accommodation and compromise. These intergenerational effects were compounded by institutional memory systems within military organizations that preserved tactical knowledge about enemy vulnerabilities while maintaining emotional connections to fallen comrades, whose deaths demanded vengeance rather than forgiveness. Professional military cultures that celebrated loyalty to deceased personnel found it difficult to embrace policies that seemed to minimize the significance of their sacrifices. The children who grew up knowing only war and imprisonment represented perhaps the most tragic consequence of prolonged conflicts that normalized extreme measures as necessary responses to existential threats. These individuals developed psychological frameworks and behavioral patterns that were adapted to survival in violent environments, but completely inadequate for functioning in peaceful societies. Many war children became permanent refugees who could never successfully integrate into stable communities because their fundamental assumptions about human nature and social relationships had been shaped by experiences of systematic cruelty and betrayal. Their capacity for trust and emotional intimacy had been damaged in ways that made normal family relationships and peaceful pursuits seem impossible or meaningless. Others became perpetrators of violence in subsequent conflicts because warfare provided the only social contexts where their psychological adaptations served useful purposes rather than creating obstacles to successful functioning. Their expertise in surviving and inflicting brutality made them valuable military assets whose skills would be lost in peaceful environments. The question of whether true peace was possible when trust had been broken so thoroughly through systematic prisoner abuse required examination of fundamental assumptions about human nature and the possibility of moral progress through institutional reform. Traditional approaches to conflict resolution assumed that hostile relationships could be transformed through negotiation and compromise once underlying conflicts of interest had been resolved through political agreements. But the psychological damage inflicted through extreme prisoner treatment created forms of trauma that could not be healed through purely political means, because they involved violations of basic trust that made normal social relationships seem impossibly dangerous. Survivors of systematic cruelty often developed permanent hypervigilance and paranoid tendencies that made them unable to accept peace agreements as genuine rather than temporary tactical maneuvers designed to facilitate future attacks. The institutional momentum toward increasingly harsh treatment of prisoners created cultural changes that extended far beyond military organizations to influence civilian attitudes and political expectations in ways that made moderate policies seem naive or treasonous. Societies that had mobilized for total war found it difficult to readjust to peaceful conditions because the psychological adaptations required for extreme conflict were incompatible with the trust and cooperation necessary for successful civilian governance. The question of whether honor could exist in total war exposed fundamental contradictions between traditional warrior values and the reality of modern conflicts that threatened entire civilizations, rather than simply competing for political dominance. Classical concepts of honor assumed that warfare occurred between equals who shared basic assumptions about appropriate behavior and recognized mutual obligations to respect certain limits on acceptable conduct. But conflicts against cosmic enemies that sought complete annihilation of their opponents eliminated any shared moral foundation that could support honor-based restraints on military behavior. When the alternative to victory was not defeat but absolute extinction, traditional warrior codes became suicide pacts rather than noble principles worthy of preservation. This reality forced fundamental reconsideration of what honor might mean under conditions where survival required abandonment of every moral principle that had previously defined civilized behavior. Some argued that true honor required maintaining ethical standards regardless of consequences, even if such commitment led to destruction of everything one sought to protect. Others insisted that honor demanded whatever actions were necessary to ensure survival of one's people and culture, regardless of traditional moral constraints. The philosophical weight of prisoner treatment ultimately revealed that the methods used to defeat enemies inevitably shaped the character of those who employed them, creating feedback loops between tactical decisions and cultural values that influenced the fundamental nature of the civilizations they were designed to protect. Victory achieved through systematic cruelty produced societies that were fundamentally different from those they had originally sought to defend, raising questions about whether such victories were meaningful in any important sense. Understanding these dynamics required recognizing that prisoner treatment was never simply a military tactic or humanitarian concern, but a reflection of the deepest assumptions about reality, morality, and purpose that shaped how civilizations understood their place in the universe. The choices made about how to treat captured enemies revealed core beliefs about the nature of consciousness, the meaning of suffering, and the possibility of redemption that defined the moral boundaries within which societies operated. These philosophical implications extended far beyond immediate military objectives to influence every aspect of cultural development, from religious practices to educational systems to political institutions that shaped how subsequent generations understood their relationship to other forms of life. The legacy of extreme prisoner treatment created psychological and cultural changes that persisted long after specific conflicts had ended, influencing the character of entire civilizations in ways that were often invisible to those who lived within them. The gradual normalization of extreme measures through repeated exposure to existential threats demonstrated how moral frameworks that seemed permanent and universal could be systematically undermined through incremental changes that each seemed reasonable when considered independently. The most effective way to destroy a civilization's commitment to humane values was not to attack them directly, but to create circumstances that forced repeated choices between survival and principle until the distinction between them became meaningless. But this process also revealed the importance of conscious moral choice in maintaining civilized standards under extreme pressure. Because the descent into barbarism was never inevitable, but always resulted from cumulative decisions by individuals who chose immediate advantage over long-term consequences. Understanding this dynamic provided hope that different choices might produce different outcomes, even under the most challenging circumstances imaginable.